ideally daily, that your word is life and that can breathe life into ours. So I just pray that we have availed ourselves of it, that we enjoy your company this morning, that you would guide our discussions, that they would be on point, accurate with your word and the intent you have for it, edifying to you and your Son Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen. All right, so you should have read the first 4 chapters of the book of Nehemiah, which means another 4 coming your way. 5 through 8 will be the reading allotment for this week. We've got a 13-chapter book, so I chopped that up into 3 weeks, 4, 4, and 5 in terms of the workload, so to speak. Hopefully you recognize that there is some level of continuity and consistency between the book of Nehemiah that we've just started this week and the book of Ezra that we concluded after 2 weeks of sojourn. And I'll get into kind of connecting those dots a little bit in a moment. But before I do any of that, was there any comment or question that anybody had regarding this past week's readings that you wanted to raise in our, what I'll call our open mic session? And Sharon Lauterbach's not here. She would have 7 of them if she were here. I mean, good night, Sharon. You can't leave me hanging.
I just thought it was interesting because we're studying Nehemiah in church, right?
Yes.
Yeah. That there was a lot of information that I had going into it that I hadn't had previously.
Good.
In Nehemiah, so I enjoyed it even more than you.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, probably. I think reading Ezra leading into it maybe gave a little more backstory. Which, yeah, might create a little more insight into some stuff that you might have read just reading Nehemiah and think, oh, it's interesting, but I understand it more because of whatever. Yeah. Pastor Marcus and I did not coordinate that. That was, I mean, he knows generally what I'm covering, but I don't think he picked Nehemiah as a sermon series because it was on our plate. It just, the Lord led him in that direction, and so they're overlapping, which is cool when that happens.
And we'll see it in reverse a little bit, too, because we'll get probably a little bit ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, we definitely will.
And then we'll catch up and get it again.
Yeah, he'll be doing a much slower pace through Nehemiah. We're going to be in and out in 3 weeks, and I don't know how long his sermon series is, but more than 3 weeks, as we're already in week. Something is in Nehemiah that God wants you to know. Agree. Any other comments or questions from this week's readings? Well, let's do a little bit of that, kind of connecting the dots. I wanted, before we got into the actual meat of the book, I wanted to orient this book to Ezra. And again, some of that's pretty obvious, but there's a few things that maybe kind of get lost in it. So for my own sake, if not for yours, let's hit on a few high-level things of commonality and then a few areas where they diverge. First, both books, again, we're talking about the book of Ezra, which we just finished, and the book of Nehemiah, which are now, not the people, the books. Both books deal with post-Babylonian exile. So they're all in that time frame. Recall that God used the nation of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar was the rod, so to speak, to discipline the people of Judah. They were taken over. Jerusalem was ransacked, and the people were deported from Judah to Babylon. God had prophesied through several prophets that the period of exile would last 70 years, at which time his people would be able to return to their land. And so these 2 books are in that post-exile, after the 70 years time frame. The chronology is consistent between the books. There's, in fact, a little overlap. You haven't gotten there yet unless you are an overachiever and you've read ahead. But in some of the later chapters, at least later than the first 4, Ezra's going to show up in the book of Nehemiah. So they're both there at the same time. Ezra lands first. Nehemiah and his efforts come while Ezra's there. He's part of the second wave, or at least not the first wave, is Nehemiah. Ezra begins, as you recall, when the Persian king at that time said, you know what, y'all can go home, essentially. So Ezra went home with various folks, and then Nehemiah came a little time later. We'll read about his, how he punched his ticket as we get into the book of Nehemiah. Both deal with the returning exiled Jews' desire to rebuild what had been ransacked by the Babylonians. The book of Ezra was primarily focused on the rebuilding of the temple and the altar and the components of the temple. The book of Nehemiah is more focused on the city itself, particularly the city walls. As you recall, as we've been reading through the Old Testament, a lot of these cities were fortified by walls. Jericho's the obvious example. They had yell and the walls came down. So Jerusalem had a similar fortification which protected its citizens, and it was located in an interesting topographical setting where it was on a hill and you could kind of see the attackers, so to speak. But the wall was in disrepair to the point that the city was vulnerable and was not a safe place. And so Nehemiah's focus and concern, as put on his heart by God, was to tend to that aspect of what was left behind when the people got deported to Babylon. Both deal with continued, I'm going to say the word anti-Semitism, opposition, but the peoples that were there were not Jewish peoples, and they didn't want the Jews back. And they certainly didn't want the Jews back building, their temple and fortifying their city again. So again, we would now call that anti-Semitism, and it was, it's nothing new under the sun, and it was alive and well in both of these books, and they had to contend with both of these books. In both of these books. All right, go to Nehemiah chapter 1 if you're not already there. We're going to go ahead and set the stage for Nehemiah's role in this post-exile return to Jerusalem. Can I get a volunteer, I should say, to read the first 4 verses of Nehemiah chapter 1? Show Mark by hand so he knows where to bring the microphone. Got to have that hand a little higher so we can actually... Sitting on the hand is not a way to raise your hand, folks. Come on. 1 through 4, chapter 1.
The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. And it came to pass in the month of Chislew, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace, then that Hanani, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted and prayed before God, the God of heaven.
All right, thank you, Patrick. All right, so Nehemiah gets word from the homeland, so to speak, from Hanani, and I can't tell, and I didn't honestly do the research, whether Hanani was one of the ones who was left or had returned and is now coming back to report. And let me pause there. Recall that the Babylonians didn't take everybody. They basically took the people they thought had any value. So kind of like the dregs of society got left there, and they got introduced to these other people that were now imported into Jerusalem, the people that the Babylonians felt might have some value in their society, be it labor or trainable to serve in the king's court or whatnot. Those were taken. So there were some remnant, as Patrick's translation said, and obviously there were people now returned. So I don't know whether Hanani is, which of those he is, but he comes back and he basically reports to Nehemiah, things are bad. The people there are struggling. My translation, I think I heard something similar to you. They're in great disgrace. So they were kind of equating this status as not just only dangerous, but shameful to some extent. And this report obviously greatly impacted Nehemiah. The last verse that Patrick read, he wept and he fasted for some length of time, and he prayed to God in the midst of that. And we're going to not read the prayer entirely, but verses 5 through the rest of the chapter is really is Nehemiah's prayer to God as he is digesting this news and trying to seek guidance from the Lord as to why, what can I do, those sorts of things. So some of the things that I pulled out of the prayer just for the sake of time, in verse 5, he begins by acknowledging who God is. We've seen that pattern a few times recently, where the prayer begins acknowledging Almighty Lord God, words to that effect, kind of setting the stage for I am talking to the Almighty, and I'm aware of that because I'm acknowledging that from the get-go. He entreats God's attention. My verse 6 says, let your eyes be open and your ears attentive. So not that God isn't, and he would be unaware of what's happening, because we know that's not who God is. But nonetheless, Nehemiah, seeks his attention. I found verses 6 and 7 interesting. Nehemiah confessed Israel's sins and his own sins. And I thought that was really impressive. He wasn't just blaming, all of his ancestors who had rejected God and got the nation to be deported, and in this post-exile scenario, he kind of owned up to his part in it, even though obviously he post-dated all of those activities, but he recognized he wasn't blameless. It's not, my forefathers did this terrible thing, and now we're suffering the consequences. He's also pointing a finger at himself and saying, I'm kind of guilty too, even though they did so-and-so. So did I. So he's acknowledging and confessing sins of his own as well as his people's. He's asking the Lord to remember the promise to restore his people. That's in verses 8 through 10. If they repent and return to him. So he's not necessarily promising that they will do that, but kind of reminding the Lord that you had indicated if our people turn to you, then you will show kindness and favor. And then he ends with this comment in verse 11, where I will read in my translation. Please, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to that of your servants who delight to revere your name. Give your servant success today and have compassion on him in the presence of this man. At the time, I was the king's cupbearer. So we're going to hit that last part first. And yes, this was touched on a bit in the sermon from a couple weeks ago. But Nehemiah says, I was the king's cupbearer. What is that? First off, what would a cupbearer be? What would that person be doing in the king's service? Let's be sure we understand what that even means. Stephen. Good, exactly. So this person would be kind of the last line of defense for an assassination attempt via poisoning beverage. So the wine would be poured, and I kind of thought, I thought through, and I've heard a couple of ways that this would work, where the cupbearer would accomplish this task. One is he would be, and I'm using the masculine pronoun because at this point it was a man. Certainly Nehemiah was. So either the cupbearer would be the last one to see the wine, come and give it, have a drink himself, or the cup would be there and the king would have him pour some out of that cup into a different cup. The cupbearer would drink it first, and he's still standing, so things are good, versus he keels over and he dies and the king knows I'm not thirsty anymore. But essentially, yes, the cupbearer is the one who would take the fall if the wine or the beverage or whatever had been poisoned by someone trying to kill the king. That was a pretty important role. I mean, the king relies heavily on this individual. And Nehemiah was that individual. And I think we're going to see how that may have cut both ways as we get into chapter 2 and Nehemiah's request of the king when we get there. Prior to that statement, at the end of the prayer part, he says, give your servant success today and have compassion on him in the presence of this man. So who is this man that Nehemiah is referring to? King. Yes, thank you. So the king. So Nehemiah is praying and anticipating, and I'm a little concerned about the phrase success today. I don't personally believe that he was speaking this particular prayer at the moment before he goes into the king, because chapter 2 begins in a way that suggests this wasn't a plan. But he is anticipating, feeling burdened, I would say, with the plan of going to his boss, the king, and bringing this issue to the king's attention. And he's wanting God's help to do that effectively. So let's get into chapter 2. Can I get a different reader for verses 1 through 2 of Nehemiah chapter 2? Help Mark out. Come on, hands in the air. Wave them around like you just don't care. All right, Barbara, good deal.
How many, 1 and 2?
Yeah, just 1 and 2, if you would.
Yeah, but look. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid.
All right, pause right there. So I think that last part, I was very much afraid, suggests to me that he wasn't planning on communicating sadness at this moment. I think this kind of caught him by surprise. I could be wrong on that, but the reaction to me seems like, oh my gosh, I'm showing what I wasn't supposed to show. Kings aren't supposed to have sad people showing up. Sometimes kings have no tolerance for that, and you're out of here, or I'm going to kill you, or, kings are a fickle bunch. So he doesn't do this, as he says. I've not done. The king basically says, I've never seen you like this before. What's wrong with you? And his response is fear. So I personally think this encounter, or at least this moment of this encounter, was not to script. I think Nehemiah had been praying and had been waiting and had, I'm envisioning, I'm putting myself in Nehemiah's shoe as best one can in this situation, thinking about, the right time. When would be the right time to bring this up? And maybe kind of contemplating what would I say when that right time comes, and it's going to be at some future time. Then all of a sudden, this moment comes now. And this was not the right time. I hadn't written that this would be the right time. This was not on my radar, but oh my goodness, now the king's talking to me about this issue. Mick, you had a comment.
One of the commentaries I read said that you were forbidden to be sad in front of the king. The king was such a wonderful person that just being in his presence should make you happy.
Yeah, perfect. And that's why, he was fearful. And those who recall from the book of Esther when her cousin says, you're in the queen position for such a time as this. And she says, well, he's not called me in the last month or whatever it was, and I just can't go and talk to the king. Kind of the same deal. The king calls the shots, and I think, to your point, Nick, exactly. The fear he had was because you don't do this in front of the king. And he didn't plan, so he wouldn't have planned to be sad and be obviously visibly sad in front of the king for the king to say, what's wrong with you? Because his immediate response is fear. Anyhow, so now he has this, I would call it a surprising, unexpected moment. And what does he do with it? Let's continue our reading. If somebody else could take verses 3 through 5, same chapter. Chapter 2, 3 through 5. Lee, or it was Leslie, got it. Lee, we'll get you next time. There's going to be more reading opportunities. Go ahead, Leslie.
I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it.
All right, thank you. So there's a dialogue. Nehemiah is afraid when the king asks, why are you sad? This is not sickness, this is sadness of the heart. Nehemiah responds, and he owns up to why he's sad. He tells him as much. And in the midst of this, the king asks, I think this interesting, what is it you request? The king is reading between the lines. Nothing in verse, as I read it, nothing in verse 3 suggests I want you to do something, king, or I want to do something. He's just answering the question. I'm sad because Jerusalem's a wreck. I just got told a week ago by Hanani that the place is in ruins and the people are disgraced and in great turmoil. The king sees in the midst of that narrative that Nehemiah wants something, and so he prompts Nehemiah, what do you want? I think, hey, Gary. Hey. That's Gary. Good to have you. I think, to me, one of the most compelling things in this whole book, and one of the more compelling things in this whole quarter, is the end of verse 4, which Pastor Marcus did touch on, and we're going to spend a little more time on. So I prayed to the God of heaven, and then verse 5, and I answered the king. And as we read this narrative, as Pastor Marcus's sermon, I think, correctly said, this prayer to the God of heaven was not a, I'll get back at you, king, with my answer. It was in the midst of a flowing dialogue. And so I'm going to do a little role play first to get a sense of what we're talking about from a time standpoint. I gave Mark the heads up. Mark is going to become our King Artaxerxes, and I'm going to do my best to become Nehemiah. I am going to do my best to allow what I think would be the longest possible time you could take between hearing the king's question and answering it without being really weird and kind of out of place. And I'd like at least one of you to break out your watch or your phone and time. I want to get a time from somebody. How long are we talking about in this? And the young guy here is going to do it. Thank you, Jonah. So we're going to do that. So Mark, if you would read the question in verse 4, and then I'm going to, like I said, give an answer in a way that I think might be the longest time it could possibly have taken and still be a fluid discussion. Go ahead.
What is your request?
If it pleases the king. What are we talking about there?
4.33.
All right, 4.33 seconds. Now, maybe I could have paused a little longer. That guy, I might have stretched that to 10 seconds, perhaps. We're talking seconds. I think it's clear if this is a dialogue and not a, hold on, I'll get back to you tomorrow when I have a good answer. There's no indication of that. They're talking. So whether it's 4.33 seconds and there's kind of this pause, or the person's thinking, but really they're praying, or maybe they take a longer time. You don't let, if you don't show up sad in front of the king, make sure that you don't ignore a king's question. You answer it, and you answer it decently, quickly, and cogently, or your head might be in the chopping block as well. So I think there is something in the, I'm going to say 5 to 10 second probably time frame that we're talking about at the end of verse 4. So I prayed to the God of heaven. So my question to self and my question to you all is, what kind of prayer can one offer in 5 to 10 seconds?
A very effective one.
Go. That's. Ignore that answer. That's a great answer. I literally have a tremendously effective God-honoring prayer when I re-ask the question after we've talked about what kind of prayer can one answer in 5 to 10 seconds. Doggone you, Chris. But let's talk about the details. So what kind of prayer can one answer? I ask that, and I ask it in that way because I'm being candid. In my own sense, I would think there's no time to, no prayer. I mean, let alone a prayer that has any meaning to it. My first reaction would be there's not enough time to pray. Maybe y'all are quick prayers and you do the popcorn prayers. I'm generally not that type, so to me that would be like a not seen prayer opportunity, personally. Barbara, you had your hand, and then Tony.
Well, I think it's obvious that Nehemiah had been praying before he got before the king.
He did.
So he had an ongoing dialogue with God about this situation.
Agree.
And maybe it was just real quick. Okay, God, this is it. And that's all that he needed.
All right, and you could say that within 5 to 10 seconds. Mm-hmm. Good. Tony.
3 words. God help me.
God help me.
Asking for help.
Yes, good. Lee.
God, give me the words.
Give me the words. Perfect. Good. So, we've come up with several prayers. Chris, you're not going to go back to the big answer. Okay? Because I'm not going to call on you if you do that. Ruin my lesson, this guy. Go ahead.
My brother was in the first Gulf War.
Okay.
And when he got back, now I understand there was nowhere near the conflict as our other engagements in history. But as he got to see combat, he said that his prayer was, Lord, I know I'm a beep. It should be beat down.
Okay.
One more time. Just one more time.
Okay.
Something simple like that, I think really shows the heart posture that God honors.
Excellent.
I learned to pray in right field. Please, dear Lord, don't let us meet.
Okay. Could say that within 10 seconds, I think.
I can relate to what Chris is saying, and probably Chris too.
Yeah, and your military background, or your law enforcement background?
Just before you get out of that car. I wasn't saved when I first started, so there's a clear difference. So just go with me, God. And he does.
Excellent.
I'm sure others can probably testify to that.
Yeah, excellent. So you guys are hitting some good insights, and yes.
On a dark building where there's a homeless person, I say, be with me, God.
So the answer is lots of different prayers can be offered in 4.33 to 10 seconds, including prayers that are effective and honoring to God, as Chris said earlier, accurately so. Nehemiah offered a prayer of this nature. He wouldn't have had time to do anything other than a prayer of this nature. Indeed, correct, as Barbara said, he had been praying. At the end of chapter 1 was about him fasting and weeping and praying to the Lord, and we got a glimpse of one such prayer. So surely he had been prayerful long before and leading up to this moment. So it wasn't a God, I haven't talked to you in a month, but I need you right now kind of prayer. It was a God, apparently it's happening now. I've been praying for the perfect time, and apparently, according to you, it's now. Please help me, or whatever. How often do we, here's the more challenging question, how often do we miss these 4.33 to 10-second prayer opportunities in our life?
Every day.
I mean, I was really convicted by this. Really convicted by this. Again, because in my mindset, surely I have said the prayers that we kind of talked about. In my world, that's a rarity. I'm a little more of a liturgical guy in the sense that I kind of have like a prayer time. And I certainly I'll pray when something comes up, but I guess maybe it's because I'm a lawyer. I talk and I use more words than can be put into 4.33 to 10 seconds. So I'm generally not a quick prayer kind of guy. And so as I would be in this situation, the king Artaxerxes, who sounds a lot like Mark Pulaski, says, what is your request? I don't know that I would sit and think, I've got time to pray about this before I answer the king. In my normal experience in life, I just do what I think is best, and hopefully it's decently good. But I don't pause. I don't take this moment. And all it takes is 4.33 to 10 seconds of moment to stop what you're doing. Don't take that first step. Ask the Lord to guide that first step and the one that follows. I have the right words, or protect me, or it's time, you know what I need, or the things that we've said that don't take hardly any words and don't take hardly any time, and yet seize a moment to tap into the Lord and His favor and His guidance before we do answer that question or exit the car or whatever thing we might be encountering. There are so many moments to offer these kind of prayers throughout a day that I just frankly miss. I don't acknowledge them as prayer opportunities. That is, they don't hit my radar as such, and I just don't pray in those moments when I could and should. That's kind of that's what's convicting me and hitting me in the gut from this episode is, oh my goodness, Nehemiah wisely did this, and it only had a few moments of time, and only had the chance to utter 10 words or something to that effect, and it worked. And we're going to see the fact that it worked in just a second. Tony, your thoughts?
I think of training a child to say bedtime prayers every night, certain time, certain place.
Yep.
Do that getting up in the morning. Thank God for the day.
I agree, yeah, and I think, to your point, I think this works better in a life that is prayer-infused, one who is regularly communicating with the Lord. And I think I generally am such a person, but I just don't generally connect the dot to these fleeting moments where I can say a prayer right then, too, not just in the morning when I get up or in the, before I go to bed with my boys or any other, doesn't. Agree. Yeah, you're right, and that's kind of what's hitting me about this episode. Is it's every bit as meaningful a prayer as the longer ones that we have a set time of our day or evening to be routinely doing. These opportunities that pop up. So this opportunity popped up. The king asked him, "What do you want?" So I prayed to the God of heaven and answered the king, if it pleases the king. Blah blah. All right, so Nehemiah does have this opportunity. Again, I'm scripting this. I'm reading in this scenario. Nehemiah had been prayerful to God. He was obviously greatly distraught over the state of affairs, as was reported to him. He had every intention of coming to the king because he asked the Lord, give me success before this man. And yet he shows up this day or that, the next day, and he's got a sad face, and the king calls him out, and suddenly the moment's now. This was not the moment I was planning. I was going to, have this great eloquent thing to say to the king, and it was going to work wonders. And all of a sudden, I'm sad looking, and the king challenges me, and now now it's go time. But he prays and he answers the king, and things go well. So let's read the rest of the dialogue, particularly verses 6 through 9. Can I get one more reader to read verses 6 through 9 of Nehemiah chapter 2? Lee Young, yes, thank you. You had volunteered earlier. Can I give you all those verses, Lee? Are you up for the task?
Yeah, 6 through 9.
Please, thank you.
Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take? And when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Aspa, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lee. All right, so Nehemiah had great answers to these questions. The king asked, "What do you want from me?" "I want to go home." "Well, what kind of time frame do you need?" And he had an answer to that question. And then he said, and by the way, I think I also need these things. I mean, Nehemiah had thought through really well to pull this off. What does one need? You need time to go there. You need blessing of the king. You need time to go there. You're going to be traversing through lands that you don't rule or occupy, but your boss has a say in what goes on in the Trans-Euphrates. So I think I need letters from your honor, the king, so I can have safe passage. I need you to give me something so that I can get wood from the forest that's being overseen by Asaph. And I mean, so Nehemiah had, I think, a well thought out agenda, which again, I believe he was going to lay out in this wonderful, perfect moment, which was not what happened. I mean, it was not going to be this particular moment, but he was ready. The point is he was ready. He had thought through it. He had fasted. He had prayed. He had communed with God a lot. I think he had used his own intellect and ability to reason and rationalize, as we should as well when we have these opportunities to do work for the Lord, is use what God's given us of ourselves, tap into God's strength and his wisdom to enlighten us as to things that we think are good that aren't, or things we hadn't thought of that we need to. So Nehemiah, I think, lays out a really good case for the king as to what is needed, and the king grants his request. Mick?
I like the way that he stated it. He didn't say, "I want to go to Judah." He said, "You send me. You send me to Judah." And that, so he made the king kind of a partner in this thing. So
great point. Yeah, and then he could tell the folks he encounters, "I'm on mission from the king." Versus yeah, right. I got proof. It's a notarized whatever. Yeah, exactly, Mick. So he did it well. So I'm going to pause here for a second. We recall at the end of chapter 1 that he was the king's cupbearer. To me, that cuts both ways on this issue of being sent to Jerusalem. So in what way would being the king's cupbearer be beneficial to Nehemiah as he's making this request to the king? And then we're going to ask the opposite question.
Familiar with the king, and they're face to face.
Okay, so he has an audience of sorts with the king. He sees him fairly often. I'm assuming the king drinks whatever he's drinking. He probably has beverages throughout the day, and if this guy's the cupbearer, he's seeing the king a whole bunch. So there's a relationship, there's a familiarity. Good.
Trusting, because I think the cupbearer had to take a sip of the...
Yeah, we hit that a little before y'all got here. Absolutely. This guy was a safety valve for any assassination attempts that would involve beverage and poisoning. Nick?
Said he would be a trusted person, somebody with high character, and he would be in the king's presence a lot. He'd be around him, so they would, king probably would go to him as, kind of an advisor at times.
I agree with that. Yes, Lee and Mark.
He's an employee, really, of the king.
He is, definitely.
Servant of the king, so being that, if you mess with him, you're messing with the king's property.
Okay, so maybe that gives him a little more protection from any outside detractors? Is that, yeah, interesting. Hadn't thought of that. That's a good point. Mark?
Yeah, I was just going to say a similar thing, but maybe a little bit more dramatic.
Oh, let's break out the drama.
You tend to trust somebody who's willing to lay their life down for you.
Ah, well said, Mark. Yeah. And Nehemiah was definitely such a person in this role. So so those are great, I think, correct assessments for why being the king's cupbearer maybe would be helpful to him as he is presenting this request. Let's flip it. Why would being the cupbearer not be helpful?
You would probably, to be a cupbearer, you have to be a trustworthy person, and I'm sure it's hard to find someone that you can trust with your life that way, and so having to replace him.
Yeah.
If he's gone, who's going to be taking those steps for him?
Exactly.
Making sure it's someone he can trust.
Yeah.
It's not going to use that to their own advantage.
I had the same thought. I mean, everything that we said, which I think is accurate for why Nehemiah would be viewed highly by the king, which I think is kind of what y'all touched on, would maybe be the reason why the king would want him to stay. No, you stay here. You're the guy I can count on. You've been my cupbearer for 20 years, and I haven't died once, and I don't want you gone and hire somebody else who doesn't do the job well or doesn't like me or is, you know.
Big shoes to fill.
Big shoes to fill, and my life's on the line if I don't fill them well. You have proven to keep me alive, and I don't want you going off to Jerusalem for who knows, even though you give me a time frame. Tony.
Well, I keep thinking that the king trusted him, so he knew he could get this job done, but that's not.
No, yeah, you're right. I mean, the question now is kind of why would that be bad news? But I think where I'm going with all this is, well, let me read you the title for this lesson that I put. Prayer plus preparation plus opportunity equals blessing. And part of the preparation, I think, and I'm going to connect that dot toward the end, but part of the preparation component of my looking at this is the fact that at this moment, Nehemiah did earn the trust of King Artaxerxes and was the king's cupbearer and did have a regular audience with the king. And the king presumably liked him well enough because he saw him multiple times a day, even if he didn't, speak on any given day, and had earned the king's trust and probably had demonstrated to the king his competence. But by the same token, those take, if the king were of a very selfish mindset, and let's face it, most kings are. That's one of the attributes of a king, I think, and that's why you don't show up looking sad or whatever else, because the king can't tolerate people that aren't, following the rules. And so if the king is of a selfish mindset, he might think, Nehemiah, you're wonderful. No, I don't want you to go. Send your cousin. Send Hananiah. I'll send him papers or whatever else. But part of what Nehemiah encountered in King Artaxerxes was a willingness to allow this trusted advisor, this critical employee, when he also said his employee, this critically important trusted employee, to be gone. We don't know how long. It says he gave him a time frame. How long will you be gone? So I gave him a definite time. It doesn't tell us what that was. But the book reads, it's a good while. So the king is going to be without this guy for a good while, and yet the king ultimately says, granted. Here are the 6 letters you want, and by the way, I'm going to escort you there with some of my army, my cavalry. You're not going to be wandering around with pieces of paper. You're going to have armed people beside you because I do value and I trust you, and I'm not going to let my trusted employee get harmed by some rogues out in the forest, who want to do stranger harm. You had a question, Chris?
Well, I was going to say is one of the negative attributes could be that the king could interpret Nehemiah's request as a breach of etiquette. In other words, you've been in my presence. Yes, I've trusted you with being my cupbearer, but you've probably also been present to other engagements, other people, and there's an etiquette, and you have breached that etiquette with your personal request. I don't know who you think I am, but you serve me.
Yeah.
The king could have
of course
totally flipped the script and said, I'm the one who's on the throne. You just bring me the cup and keep your yap.
Yeah.
It could have easily been
absolutely.
a double-edged sword.
Absolutely, and again, that would be even kind of an expected response from a self-focused king, as we would, I think, rightly view most of them to be. Could have heard that loud and clear. Yes, Patrick.
It kind of makes me think of how you said the way you pray, going back to verse 11 and chapter 1.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if it's grammatically correct because I haven't done that in a while. But he says, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. He was praying expectantly that day for when he gets in the sight of the man.
Good, I like that.
That he would have mercy in the sight of the king.
Good point.
So, and then the quick shotgun prayer is that I think maybe we do it more often than we think. Sometimes
maybe.
Conversations, believers and unbelievers, and just that pause, even if just, maybe it's certainly not audible.
4.33 second pause.
Lord.
Yeah, right. How prayers does that, Lord?
That's it.
with a question marks like Lord. Okay, here we go. Yeah, no, you're right, Patrick. Back to the verse. It doesn't say, and have compassion on him in the presence of this man today. It's like, give me success today. So I think that's a yes. I would like to read it that way because it doesn't appear that this happened the same day or that Nehemiah was planning on this encounter to unfold the way it did.
I thought it was interesting that he set a time to be gone. He told the king how long he would be gone before he even saw the walls and knew how much work was to be done. So.
Agree. Where would he reach that conclusion other than maybe God impressing on his heart? You're gonna, you need to ask for a year. Trust me, when you get there, you're going to see this place is going to be a disaster. You're going to need every bit of a year. Don't say 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever else. Ask for more than you think because you'll need every bit of it.
I still
Coach.
think the king could think of the cupbearer as being expendable. He's just a cupbearer. So if we lose him, we'll have another one. So I don't know what the working schedule is, 24 hours a day, or if we got leave time. But
Right. Is there a shift A, B, and C cupbearer?
Well, and he said he mourned for days. And so was he not in the presence of the king during all those days he was mourning?
Or did he pretty himself up before he went in there so he didn't show his mourning state?
Right.
Good questions. Those are all fair questions. And yeah, certainly if an assassination's happening or attempt's happening, the cupbearer is the first to go, and then you have to have somebody else. So yeah, to that extent, they are expendable because it's just a warm body that's going to take the poison instead of the king. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. That's a good point. So I hand over here.
It's okay. We'll move.
All right, very good. Anyhow, so as I'm reading this, I thought his position, maybe does give him the potential to have a more favorable response from the king. But if the king were thinking more about the king than about his kindness to Nehemiah, he might think, I want you here and no one else. But when the king does give his favor to Nehemiah's request, my translation reads a little different than what Lee read at the end of verse 8, but essentially the same. Mine says, the king granted my request, for I was graciously strengthened by my God. So Nehemiah, in the midst of the things that he had done prior to that moment, the fasting, the praying, the thinking through the logistics, the details, that if he's going to leave this effort, he kind of needs to have some handle of it, being open to the Lord guiding him as to timing and all these other things. Having, again, earned the trust of the king by being an effective cupbearer. Still, it's all that he rightly viewed, I got success today by the gracious strengthening of my God. Which is exactly what he prayed and what Patrick just kind of walked through in terms of the grammar, maybe that today, he had prayed, Lord, give me success before this man. He now is sitting there at the other end of success before this man, and he correctly attributes that success to God. Not, boy, I nailed it. I did a great job of calculating how much I'm going to need and all the particulars. He gave God's due, and it was excellent. And it doesn't stop there either. So so he's got the letters, and he's permitted to go. And one man is not going to rebuild the wall. He needs to have people to come alongside him. So the rest of chapter 2 is him doing an assessment and him ultimately talking to the people that are now in Jerusalem, both the remnant who remained and the returning exiles. And I'm going to just read verse 18. I told them how the gracious hand of my God had been on me and what the king had said to me. They said, let's start rebuilding. And they were encouraged to do this good work. So the Lord impressed on Nehemiah, or blessed Nehemiah with success. Nehemiah was able to enlist other workers for this, in part because of what God had done for Nehemiah. Nehemiah basically gave a testimony. Man, I was in front of Artaxerxes, I was sad, I didn't plan it. I was praying for a great moment, and this became the moment, and here's what happened, and the king was lovingly gracious to me, and it can only be from the hand of God. Who's with me? And they're like, that sounds great. I'm with you. If God did that, then he's going to help us succeed. And so the praise that God received from Nehemiah in that moment in verse 8 is now praise that he was able to share with his audience, the workers, in verse 18. And they now gave voice and praise to the Lord as well. And we're eager to pick up trowel and shovel and whatever other things you need to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem. Warren, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was talking to someone this morning about how God presets things in advance. It looks like the king's heart was softened already
I think so.
when he came to him.
I think
and
so.
Also about the time frame, I believe that God may have impressed on him that it would take this long, even though he had not seen that
Agree completely.
disaster.
Yep. Oh, I agree. I think God was at work both in Nehemiah and in Nehemiah's audiences, both the king and the people that were going to ultimately be the workers rebuilding the wall. God had his hands on all that stuff, and I think because of the prayers that Nehemiah was wrestling with and offering in chapter 1. So back to my title, preparation, prayer and preparation plus opportunity meets blessing. That's a little bit of a revamping of a message that I heard from your daughter's graduation from USF with her master's degree. Betty Kasser at the time was the Florida Secretary of Education. She wasn't the president of USF, but she gave the graduation commencement. And I don't know what led her to have this, but I remember it as clear as day. She was describing luck as not being something so random and outside of our reach. And the phrase she used, which you've probably heard perhaps, is luck is when preparation meets opportunity. She was kind of speaking to the audience about essentially you make your own luck, so to speak. You prepare, you get ready for these opportunities that come. And that just stuck to me. I've heard countless graduation messages, including the several that, I was sitting in the audience. I don't remember a lick of them, but I remember that one. I remember Betty Castor saying that, and it just really resonated with me, this idea of luck as preparation meeting opportunity. So as we look at this instance, we see, I think, a lot of preparation. Nehemiah has done a lot of preparation. He also included prayer in that preparation, which is a pretty critical thing for those of us who know the Lord, to have the preparation include chiming into the Lord. He had this unexpected opportunity, showed up sad, didn't plan it. Nehemiah gets challenged by King Artaxerxes. Why are you looking so sad? You're not sick, I can tell. It's something in your heart. What's going on? And all that led to this blessed moment where he did get favor from the king, and he was able to go back to the people in Jerusalem, and they did enlist them to rebuild the wall, and you'll read more about that as we continue our travel down the book of Nehemiah. But in the midst of all of that, again, I wanted to, for myself, pause and challenge myself to be more alert for those 4.33 to 10-second moments that pop up probably countless times in any given day. And maybe, Patrick, you're right, maybe I do say something that I'm kind of less aware of, but I suspect most of those moments just fly on by, and I'm kind of driving my own ship, and I don't pause and ask, Lord, help me. Lord, now's the time. Lord, I need you to give me the words. All the things that you can say within 4.3 to 10 seconds that enlist the Lord's help and please God and allow him to do a big thing in a small moment with a small person that otherwise, isn't worthy of anything that the Lord gives us. I just hope that I will do better at seeing those moments as Nehemiah did and seized, and I hope that maybe as we pause and talk about this a bit, that all of us will be a little more mindful. You can say a quickie prayer, and God can use that quickie prayer to do a big thing.
I keep thinking, too, something you just mentioned when you were saying that is how much it pleases God that he wants to be in that continual, have that continual relationship with us where we are just in communication with him.
Agree. Yes, exactly. And it's not just about self-advancement. It's not a prayer that I can get what I want. It's a prayer to keep God with me and keep me with him. And yeah, well said, Leslie. Thank you. All right, let me close this in prayer. I think we are about out of time. Lord God, this is longer than a 4.33 second prayer as we thank you for giving us this word to read and this narrative to learn from. But I pray, again, I'll give voice to my own desire that I would be better at seeing those fleeting moments of opportunity to pray to you, to enlist you to guide my steps more often than I do in any given day, guide my words more often than I do in any given day. That this experience that Nehemiah had is an instructive one, that we can and should seek you constantly, communally, and allow you to work through us, through our words that you would put in our mouth, through the thoughts that you would trigger in our brains, that we might be your hand and your feet and your voice, so that your will be done, that your name be praised, and that we would be an honor and a blessing to you. So guide us this week as we read 4 more chapters, as we hear from you, as we try to apply these words to our lives. May we do that in a way that gives you pleasure. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, folks.